Now that Donald Trump is announcing yet another round of widespread tariffs, it's becoming even more obvious that you need to become as self-sustaining as possible, including learning how to grow some of your own food. That's why I'm here to teach you how to do it as cheap as possible. Hi, I'm Kendall, and this is part 5 of my series on how to start a food or victory garden on a budget. Today, I want to talk about one of my most requested topics, which is how to start a food garden when you're living in an apartment or another rental unit and don't have access to a ton of natural light. And stick around until the end of this video. Toward the end of this video, I'm actually going to go through a list of what plants I recommend starting out with if you are starting a food garden inside your rental unit and you're brand new to this. I've put together a list of the easiest food plants for growing in an indoor environment so that way, hopefully, even if you don't have a ton of time to put together a ton of other infrastructure and all of that, if you just start with that list, you should have the highest chance of success with these particular plants. But before we get into it, I did want to mention that I've started a new TikTok account called Seeds of Rebellion. A lot of leftist content creators have started seeing their content get suppressed or taken down altogether. I want to make sure that my spicier political takes don't ever put this gardening information at risk. So if I can get enough people to follow me over on Seeds of Rebellion, I'll start posting my food gardening content over there. That will also allow me to post much more frequently because I won't have to be balancing that content with the political organizing content that I do as well. With that being said, let's get into it. So whenever you're starting a garden, regardless of whether you're doing it outside or inside, there are 5 big factors that you have to take into account. The containers that they're being grown in, the soil, water, and light they're being given access to, and the insects that they're being exposed to. Obviously, whenever you start your garden inside, several of those factors have to be recreated artificially. So let's go through some tips on how to do that as efficiently and as cheaply as possible. First of all, as far as containers go, if you are renting, especially if you either have roommates or you're living in a small apartment, I highly recommend sticking with bags rather than pots, whether that's using reusable shopping bags like I talked about in an earlier video, or if you're buying grow bags. Either way, those are a lot easier to store at the end of the season because they can be emptied out, folded up, and stuck at the back of the closet. They're a lot less hassle to move whenever your lease is up. Just in general, they are a much more renter-friendly option. The next factor is your soil. While I always advocate for getting as budget-friendly of an option as possible, when you are doing container gardening, like with gardening inside of your apartment, you need to make sure that you are getting potting soil and not garden soil. Garden soil is just that. It's literally just straight dirt. There is no other amendments added into it. And as a result, it's really heavy. It compacts down into itself very easily. And especially when you're dealing with containers, that can be a huge problem. Potting soil, on the other hand, has been amended with things that keep it airy and light and prevent it from compacting down and becoming this solid mass. As far as watering goes, regardless of where you're doing your food garden, chances are for the majority of the growing season, you will need to water every day just because it takes an incredible amount of energy for a plant to be producing fruit. That is doubly true when you are talking about container gardening. And it is even more doubly true if the containers you are gardening in are permeable in nature. If the sides of that container are made of a material that can wick water out of the soil and then allow it to evaporate on the outside of the container, it will mean that the soil is drying out faster and needs to be watered more frequently. You definitely want to check the soil dampness every single day to see if it needs more water. You don't want it to be waterlogged, but you also don't want it to feel just completely dry in between watering. Next is probably the hardest factor to address when you are gardening inside, and that is light. That being said, there is still a ton you can do. The good news is grow lights are very, very cheap at this point. It is very easy to get grow lights. The bad news is it's also very easy to get scammed by grow lights. So I am putting together an Amazon list that I'm going to have access to over in my bio. Please do not take this list that I've put together as like the be all and end all. I am not saying that these are the only ones that you should buy. All that list is designed to do is give you a starting place. The biggest thing that you need to watch for with grow lights is making sure that they are a full spectrum light so that they will glow white in nature. Lights that aren't full spectrum, like the ones I'm talking about, end up a lot of times glowing either like a red or a purple pink type color. Not only is that less helpful for your plant, but also it causes massive headaches if those lights are in a room that you are frequently in. So just be really careful and make sure that you are getting lights that are full spectrum in nature. The other grow lights that you should stay away from entirely are the ones that clamp on to the side of a pot. Usually they tend to be like a real thin bar that's like bendy attached to this clamp. And sometimes they're even like a USB plug-in style well, do not waste your money on those. Those do not put off very much light at all. The other option that you can go with for recreating light in your apartment, you can just get a grow light light bulb and switch out a normal light in your house. That's what I did when I was renting a bedroom in a friend's house. I literally just switched out the light bulb that was in the ceiling fan in my bedroom. I switched it out with a full spectrum grow light bulb. That won't work for everyone. I know there are lots of people that are very sensitive to overhead lights, even when they aren't grow lights. So having to live like a houseplant yourself under a grow light may not be a sacrifice that you are willing to make. That's totally understandable. I recognize that I'm a little extra insane when it comes to my plants. So, but that is by far the cheapest option in terms of adding additional light into your gardening spaces. The final factor that you have to account for whenever you are starting your garden indoors is insects. So the good news is, obviously, when you are growing inside your apartment versus out in a garden, you have a much more controlled environment and don't have to worry about as many pests. The bad news is, by having your garden inside, that also means that you are not exposing those plants to beneficial insects. And most importantly, if you are growing something that fruits, something that puts off like an actual full vegetable, typically a lot of so for example, your indoor garden is not going to be visited by bees. So any of your plants that need to be pollinated in order to produce vegetables, you're going to have to recreate that yourself. However, the list of plants that I recommend you start with for your indoor garden doesn't include anything that must be manually pollinated. Everything on the list is either self-pollinating or you don't have to worry about pollination at all. So for example, tomatoes. Tomatoes are actually self-pollinating. All of their flowers have both male and female parts. So for anyone who tries to claim that being trans or being intersex is not natural, you can tell them they're full of it. Even tomatoes can do it. Finally, here's a list of plants that if you are gardening for the first time and you're starting your food garden inside, these are the plants that I recommend you start with, as long as they are things that actually make sense in the context of your life. So if anything on this list is something you won't eat, for example, obviously don't bother growing it. So first of all of your culinary herbs, incredibly easy to grow inside. They are very forgiving about how much light they're being exposed to. So you can put them pretty much anywhere as long as they're getting a little bit of light. So that would include mint, chives, parsley, lavender, basil, thyme, rosemary, all of those very amenable to being grown inside. And I also think it's worth noting that even if you're not the type of like gourmand that's cooking with fresh herbs, there are other reasons to grow an herb garden inside. For example, I not only use fresh herbs in my cooking, I even more frequently, honestly, use them in making cocktails. So if you're somebody that likes a good summer cocktail, highly recommend growing, especially basil, mint, and lavender. Those are great for cocktails. Truly, there is nothing more delicious than a basil mojito when it is 100 degrees outside. The next thing that I recommend growing in your indoor food garden are all of your leafy greens. So lettuce, spinach, kale. Similarly to fresh herbs, they are very forgiving as far as how much light they're needing. They're very easy to grow. And also, like herbs, they tend to be some of the more expensive items in the produce section. I don't know if you've ever gone and bought like fresh basil at the grocery store. It's not cheap. Similarly, buying a clamshell of kale or of spinach, that gets pricey very, very quickly. The other nice thing about growing leafy greens is that every time you go and harvest, you can take some additional seed and just sprinkle it over the soil where you just harvested and do successive seeding so that way you always have more of that plant ready to harvest the next time you go back to harvest something for your dinner. The other two plants that I recommend having on your starter list for your indoor food garden are tomatoes and strawberries. One caveat though is that any tomato plant that you're going to grow indoors, you need to make sure that it is either a container or dwarf variety of that plant. So if you look on the label for the plant or the seed packet, it will say if it is a container or dwarf variety. There are a lot of tomato plants out there that get truly massive, and so obviously that is not exactly amenable to growing inside of your apartment or growing in a container. Tomatoes also do need to be in a decent sized container, so definitely don't be putting them in like a teeny pot, but they don't need to be in the container by themselves. So for example, I pretty much never, regardless of whether I'm growing indoors, outdoors, whatever, I pretty much never plant a tomato plant by itself. It always has basil around it. Those two plants are very friendly to being grown together, and that way you can get twice the use out of a single container. Similarly, with strawberries, I recommend going back and watching my most recent gardening video, the 10 Dollar Tree gardening hacks. I talk about how you can use a Dollar Tree hamper to grow strawberries, and then on top you can plant whatever culinary herbs you want. So with those two fruiting plants, I highly recommend figuring out how you can be more economical with the container space and get twice the use out of it. And then one other word of caution that I couldn't figure out where to fit in with this video, so I just decided to tack it on at the end. If you are growing a garden on a balcony of some sort, please be sure that you check and see what the weight limit is for your balcony. Chances are you're going to be totally fine, right? I think it would probably be pretty hard to exceed the weight limit of a balcony, but soil is heavy and it does add up quickly. So if you're going to be putting a massive amount of plants out on a balcony, please just be safe, double check the weight limit, make sure that you're not going to bring your balcony crashing down on your downstairs neighbor's head. Once again, if you made it this far, thank you so much. Please be sure to go over and again, follow me on Seeds of Rebellion, where I'm hoping to start posting my gardening content moving forward. Go find me on all of the other platforms and follow me there in case anything ever happens to either my account or to this app in general. If you have any questions or other topics you'd like to see me do a video about and give you advice about in regard to your garden, let me know in the comments. I'm planning on the next video will be about building out the infrastructure for vertical gardening for as cheap as possible. So thanks so much. I'll see you in the next video. Bye, y'all.